Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Flow Over Fear podcast, where it is our mission to help you to rise above fear and realize your ultimate potential in leadership and life. I'm your host, Adam Hill, and it is my goal to share with you the human side of high performance. My guests share their experience with fear, anxiety, struggle, challenge, and most importantly, despite all of it, how they rose above it to achieve incredible results. So, if you're ready to rise up, let's get started. Today, I want to share a little bit about one of the ways in which we're absolutely unique as individuals. There's a lot of ways in which we are the same. We're very much the same as human beings in terms of what we desire, what we hate, what we want to get from our lives, who we want to make happy. But there's a lot of ways in which we're unique, and one of the ways that makes us unique is how we live out and how we embrace our core values. Whether we like it or not, we all have a set of core values that we live by. Even if we're not doing it consciously, we are adhering to a set of principles within us that guide our actions, that guide our thoughts. And one of the interesting things about that is that a lot of times when we're talking about core values, our minds immediately go to, well, that's a good thing, have a set of core values. And that's true. We do want to have a set of values and we want to articulate them because after all, we gain control over our values when we start to articulate them. When we start to actually articulate what our hearts are trying to put forth in this world, then we gain control over them. But how do we do that? And it's not always positive necessarily. So when we think of the core values that we want in our lives, where our minds go to, oh, that's a good thing. But in reality, there are also toxic values. There are also things that we value that aren't necessarily that great and that we might not even want to value, but we do anyway. Here's an example. For a very long time, I drank alcohol to cope with my anxiety. Now, anxiety in and of itself was not necessarily a bad value of mine. I wouldn't even consider that a value. It was just an emotion. It was a feeling. It was something that was a signal for me. And as we talk about in Flow Over Fear, that's what we share about fear in and of itself, is that we can rise above it. We can stop fighting it. We can get to facing it, and then we can finally embrace it. And that's what we could do with my anxiety. So that wasn't necessarily the value. But the value that I had to actually fight the fear was drinking. I valued alcohol, and that wasn't a good thing. That was a toxic value, and it came out in my behaviors. It came out in how I lived my life at that time. But over time, when I finally said enough was enough, and the pain was just too much with the alcoholism, I got sober, and I developed a new value, and I imprinted a new value within me, and that value was sobriety. And so sobriety became my new value, and that was an empowering value. So my point is that whether I liked it or not, I didn't know at the time, but I was living out a toxic value of alcohol, of using alcohol to, I was valuing alcohol over anything empowering. And my point is that there's toxic values in our lives, and there are empowering values. And the key to actually getting control over those, to moving more into the empowering values and farther away from our toxic values, is to name them, is to really articulate them and learn for ourselves what our values are and really articulate them. So how do we do that? How do we articulate our values? Well, first let me talk about our toxic values, because it's good to start there, because a lot of times the first step towards leaning into our empowering values is to identify the values that take us away from what might be empowering. And so we want to look at the bad behaviors, the bad habits, and not look at them in a shameful way, because we never want to shame ourselves. This is a very human experience, and this is not a design for perfection at all. We are always going to have toxic values that affect us. And the key, again, is to articulate them, but not to do so shamefully. Don't judge yourself over this. Just the point here is to look at what's affecting us, and when we're aware of it, when we gain that awareness and we gain that curiosity over it, then we can start to change it. Awareness leads to change. So when we're looking at our toxic values, one of the things you can ask yourself if you're not sure where to start on identifying your toxic values, I mean, sometimes it might be easy. Sometimes it may be easy to say, yeah, okay, I'm drinking way more than I should. And so alcohol is clearly something I value, and that's not a good thing. Or cigarettes or smoking is something I value. There's an inherent obsession there. Or maybe it's jealousy. Maybe it is envy. Maybe it's having. Maybe it's not being willing to do a lot of work. Maybe it's doing too much work. Some of those can be toxic. It's about how they affect us internally, or how are they causing us fear. So one of the ways you can look at that is ask yourself, where are you saying should a lot in your life? Tony Robbins would say, where are you shoulding all over yourself, right? So where are you saying should a lot in your life? For example, you might be saying, I should really stop smoking cigarettes, or I should really start looking for a job, or I should really spend more time with my family. When you're saying that, you're actually articulating a value, a toxic value, implicitly, a toxic value that you're leaning into that you know that you shouldn't. When you're smoking cigarettes, you know you shouldn't be smoking, but you're telling yourself you value the cigarettes, you value the feeling that it gives you. Or when you're saying you should spend more time with your family, you're valuing something more there in terms of what's taking you away from it. It could be work. It could be some other things. It could be anything. So what is that value? Where are you saying should a lot in your life? And that's one way to look at it. Another way to look at those toxic values is think about some of the negative emotions that you have on a daily basis. What are the 3 top negative emotions that you have on a daily basis? And what's your favorite flavor? A lot of us have that. We may be watching the news, and we may get triggered in some way, and we may actually be seeking out things that make us angry, or we may be seeking out things that invoke some kind of negative energy within us. Those are our negative values. I mean, we may have a value that leads us into, we may value cynicism, we may value anger, we may value envy. And those are not always pleasant feelings, but we lean into them because, again, because it's the discomfort that we know. And we don't want to lean into discomfort that we don't know. We don't want to be vulnerable and try to rise above that. Instead, we would rather lean into the discomfort that we know. And those are often toxic values or toxic behaviors or toxic habits that keep us away from what we truly value, what's truly in our hearts. So a lot of times these toxic values may be perceived as the armor that are surrounding our hearts, that it's surrounding our best intention, that's surrounding our vulnerability. But when we can let go of those and start to really embrace our true values, our core empowered values, that's when we can start to grow. So really one of the exercises to look at those toxic values, find the most powerful negative emotions that you feel on a daily basis, and then really do that. There's a great tool for this. It's a personality profile tool that's gaining popularity at the time, but it's been around for thousands of years, and it's called the Enneagram. And the Enneagram is basically 9 different archetypes of people that exist in this world, and primarily how they operate and how their personalities exist. And what each of those personalities, what each of those 9 personalities exhibit are values that are really the toxic values that they lean into. They call them, because it's rooted in religion, they talk about it as the sins, the 7 deadly sins, but really they're just values that are toxic. And so a lot of times it's envy, or it's pride, or it's some kind of sexual immorality or something like that. But it's a good way to get a feel for maybe what you relate to, what tugs at your heart when you look at those different personality traits in the Enneagram. And then you can decide for yourself if you fit that criteria, and then maybe that's one of the toxic values that you operate. And it also gives you a clue on how to move into your empowering values. And that's what I want to touch on now is, now that you can understand your toxic values, how do you find your empowering values? Well, a lot of times, many times, not all the time, but many times, that toxic value, finding your empowering value, finding the thing that empowers you, might just be the opposite of that toxic value. For example, if you're valuing drinking like I did, if you value alcohol to help with your anxiety or with other mental health issues or trauma or anything like that, or cigarette smoking or things like that, well, then the opposite value would be sobriety. And sobriety for me became an empowering value because it helped me to grow. But I really had to embrace it as a core value. So that became an empowering value when I did it in the right way. So that's opposite action. That's finding the opposite of that toxic value. And oftentimes that's a way to really find out what your empowering values are. The next one would be how to turn those toxic values, the toxic values that you have, into something positive. That's not necessarily the opposite, but it's like turning it into a superpower, right? Think about obsession, those obsessive natures that we have. Now, obsession can be both positive and negative. For me, when I was drinking or when I'm smoking or a lot of obsessive habits, are rooted in obsession or rooted in an obsessive personality, and that's a negative value to have that negative or toxic obsession. But what if we could channel that into something positive? Channel that into something positive where we're obsessively focused on growth, or we can or our obsessive nature focuses on obsessively training for health or achievement or things like that, or obsessively spending time with our family. Training that obsession in a positive way can really hone that value into something positive. Think about it this way: if you have an obsessive nature over if you have an obsessive nature over personal development, that obsessive nature can be negative. It can turn into greed. It can turn into greed and complete self-absorption, where you just want to look out for yourself and your well-being. And that's a negative result of obsession. But the opposite of that is it can lead to, growth or contribution or adding value. And that can be a good thing. And we've seen both sides of the spectrum on that, right? Where that value comes out in a positive and negative way. So look for the way that you can turn that toxic value into something good, into a positive superpower. I've learned to do that with anxiety. That's where I talk about the rising above fear. And it took me a while to learn and craft that design in my life, where fear became a superpower. If you'd asked me 10 years ago, can you believe that fear or anxiety can be a superpower? I'd have said absolutely not. But once I realized that I could stop fighting it, and then I could rise to the level to face it, where I'm not fighting it anymore, but I'm learning to accept it and live with it, to understand it. And then that I finally learned to rise above it, to embrace it, where I look at fear now as a signal for when I'm pushing up against my comfort zone, and it's a signal of where I have an opportunity to grow. So that in and of itself becomes a more positive value. I took a negative value and I turned it into something positive. And then finally, one way to find some empowering values, if you don't feel like you could turn your toxic values into something positive, one way to find what you can look for positively is to put yourself in a very, very calm, relaxed state, in a meditation. Breathe deeply, put yourself in an empowering posture. Breathe deep, and then remember back on 3 specific experiences. Put yourself in those experiences, in those situations where you felt proud of yourself, where you achieved something great, where you felt immense amounts of love, where you felt immense amounts of appreciation, or you accomplished something just great. The 3 most profound experiences of your life. And what are you feeling at that moment? What's in your heart? What's in your mind? Are you feeling great pride? Are you feeling great love? Did you feel like you grew? These are some of the ways that I was able to find some of my own core values. When I really looked into these and I started journaling about them, I learned that some of the toxic values that I had, like envy or obsession, drinking alcohol, or anger that I lived with in my life, that my new empowering values became love, growth, adventure, and humor. All because the experiences that I had in my life when things were at their best, when I felt proud, when I felt so joyous and free, all of those were the values that had popped into my mind, and so that was how I was able to evaluate and create those empowering values, and then I could put those two together, the toxic and the empowering, and see how they play together. For instance, if you can look at yourself when you're in a situation where you're envious or jealous or something like that, and then you take that feeling and you shift it with the feelings that you experience when you're experiencing, say, love or some kind of other positive value that you have, well, then you can shift that experience into something that is more meaningful and powerful for you. So I would suggest that you really look at this week. Take a look at your values, because when you are able to articulate them, both the toxic and the empowering values, when you're able to articulate those, you will gain better control over them. You'll be better equipped to move in the direction you want to move. Instead of being affected by outside circumstances, you'll be able to grow in the direction that you are looking to grow. And regardless of what circumstances hit you, you'll have the tools readily available to experience life from the perspective you want to with your empowering values. So until next time, thanks for joining us on Flow Over Fear, and I'll look forward to seeing you on the next show. Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to the Flow Over Fear podcast. If you'd like to learn more about getting into flow and learn the foundations of flow, I have a free video series on my website at www.adamcliffordhill.com called The Foundations of Flow. Feel free to go there and download it and start your journey to rising above fear and achieving greater flow in your life. And if you like this episode, and I'm guessing you did if you stuck around for this long, then please do me a favor and hit the subscribe button, and you will receive notifications when I have new interviews, new recaps, and new trainings that pop up on YouTube. Thanks again for joining us.